Thank you.
No slides.
Okay, I'm going to introduce the panel. To my immediate right is Neal Benezra, who's the Helen and Charles Schwab Director of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. He spearheaded its recent expansion and redesign by Snøhetta and into what is now America's largest museum of modern and contemporary art. 8 years ago, he struck a deal to take over stewardship of the Dawn and Doris Fisher collection, which now has made SF MoMA one of the most important modern art museums in the world. And he's characterized this agreement as a third way between the two previous ways, which were giving your collection to a museum and going off and forming your own. We're going to talk about that here. Norah Stone, to his right, is a trustee of SF MoMA, a member of the National Committee of the Whitney, and a member of Tate's International Council Executive Committee. She and her husband Norman, who's also a trustee of SF MoMA, maintain an art-filled property called Stonescape in the Napa Valley. It sounds absolutely amazing, and I'm looking forward to visiting it someday because it includes a vineyard, a farmhouse filled with art and mid-century Swedish design, a sculpture by Katie Noland, 2 Tyrrell sky spaces, one of which you have to swim through a pool to emerge into. And then last but not least, they built an art cave in the side of a mountain to create a private museum that houses work from their collection. It's open by appointment only. And last but not least is Howard Rosovsky, who, together with his wife Cindy, and together with several other Dallas collectors, are partners in one of the most generous philanthropic arrangements in the country, benefiting the Dallas Museum of Art, which he's going to tell you about in a moment. He and his wife also host the 2x2 for AIDS and Art, which has raised millions for the Foundation for AIDS Research and the Dallas Museum of Art's Contemporary Collection Program. Their art collection, which will ultimately benefit the DMA, is also housed in an appointment-only space called the Warehouse, which he founded with another collector. Anyway, I think we'll start by everybody telling us a bit about the subject that brings us here, and we'll start with Neal telling us about the Fisher collection and how that came to SF MoMA and what the agreement entails.
So, Carol, thank you.
Sure.
And it's great to share the stage with Norah and Howard. Wonderful to be here in Miami. Before I say a word about the
Sure.
Fisher arrangement, which is, I think, pretty interesting, I would say that one of the things that's I've come to realize in my years working in museums is that we need to be more innovative than we've been. American museums their collections have largely been formed on the basis of gifts from private collectors, generous philanthropic collectors in a particular community. And we buy really very little art in museums relative to the entire scope and scale of our collections. So what I began to see as I made my way through my career is museums kind of expecting these collections to just come to us as perhaps they did in past times. And that hasn't always worked out that way. And I think museums need to be more innovative, more creative, find a third way, not just expect this art to come to them as though they had a right to it, to its eventual ownership. So what happened was, in our particular case, the first conversation that Don Fisher and I had, the late Don Fisher, goes all the way back to 2005, the fall of 2005. And we began to talk about the possibility of the Fisher collection, which, if you're not familiar with it, it's a tremendous collection of, I would say, not just post-war, really post-1960 American and Western European work. Great strength and great depth of some of the key artists of the later 20th century. About that collection coming to the museum and trying to find interesting ways to make that happen. What Don expressed to me on many occasions was the desire that the work be seen. He cared about that above and beyond anything else. And so we eventually, after Don passed away, we eventually came to an understanding where the collection would be, the 1,100 plus works would be placed into a trust. The trust would be, and I'm giving you the kind of Reader's Digest version of this, would be placed into a trust, and the trust would essentially be placed on deposit with our museum for a minimum of 100 years, and could be renewed in increments after that. And we curate it, we educate about it, our conservators work with it, we market it, you know, we display it. Our curators, Gary Garrels in particular, our senior curator of paintings and sculpture, has installed it in the opening of our new museum. And it's what I would describe as a partnership between this family that has been long involved with our museum. Don Fisher first became a trustee in 1982, so there's a long and warm and generous relationship and great understanding, and their family and our museum.
What made it a third way? Was it the fact that it was a loan?
It's less than a gift and more than a loan, I guess I would say. That would probably be a good way to characterize it. Don Fisher would, who always was an out-of-the-box thinker, he would say to me, you really don't need to own my collection. You need to be able to exhibit my collection. And it, as an old-fashioned museum guy, it took me a while to wrap my head around that, probably 5 or 6 years, frankly. But I finally came to understand that maybe there was some truth to that if we were curating it, do people really care what it says on the label about who owns that picture? As long as the works of art are staying with the museum and we have a kind of curatorial responsibility for their presentation, it's not so bad. My job, I think, among the many jobs that a museum director has, my job most of all is to make sure that our public sees the best works of art that we can possibly bring to them. And they're, I hold that almost as a highest goal for our museum.
And you said, I just want to clarify one thing, because you said that the agreement was reached after his death, but it was on his deathbed, wasn't it?
What happened was...
the niceties of the agreement were finalized after his death.
Well, there were more than niceties, I would say. It's a thick contract. No, we came to a kind of handshake agreement of what we were going to do.
Because there was a period when he was going off and thinking of forming his own museum.
That's right, for a time.
Then,
but eventually he came back home.
Right.
And no, but when Don passed away, then Bob Fisher, who's a wonderful photography collector in his own right, and now one of our key trustees at the museum, he and I kind of locked ourselves in a room for a couple of months and worked through the contract for the arrangement. So.
Okay. So, Norah, let's hear about Stonescape and why you decided to build the art cave, because it is a museum, but in a sense.
Yes, it's a gallery. We think of it more as a gallery, but it can be referred to as a museum. Okay. Well, 25 years ago, we bought a farm in the Napa Valley, and we were collecting art at that point, but not as much and not as vigorously as we did later. So we enjoyed the few years that we had there until we decided we needed another space for the art that was in. We had hundreds of pieces in storage, and we weren't enjoying them. We couldn't. Some of them were too large. We didn't have enough space in our home in San Francisco to install them, so we decided we'd try to think of an alternative. We looked in San Francisco for a building of some sort and couldn't find anything. So luckily, one day, we were up on this farm of ours and walking along a road and said, why not do something in the side of this mountain? We were already in the middle of construction, so we had a huge mess with dirt piled everywhere with the Terrell, because we had to dig a swimming pool and make a pavilion, and we had to take some of our vineyard out. So we found ourselves with this construction zone already happening, and we had engineers come and a wonderful architect who came from New York to look at the space or looked at the side of this mountain, and we consulted with cave engineers. And of course, there are a number of those in Napa, since they make those usually for wine. This is not a wine cave. You can't even drink wine in this cave. So we were able to find out what would be involved. They said it would be relatively simple. The soils engineers were wrong on that. There were boulders, we found out later, huge boulders that came from the higher up in Diamond Mountain. So we were faced with that little problem, but we got through it. And so during the time we were doing the Terrell, we built this, and that took from 2003, I believe we started the Terrell, and we finished it all in 2007. In 2005, there was a huge storm. At Christmas time in Napa Valley, we were told it was the worst storm they'd had in 100 years, and that we were going to lose the cave because we were in the middle of construction and water was coming down from the mountain. So anyway, to make a long story short, we had a man who dedicated his whole holiday time to stay there and save it, the man who was actually boring the cave. So the cave itself is, he stayed the entire Christmas and New Year's and saved it, so he's our hero. This is a simple guy who does nothing but dig caves, and apparently he really felt dedicated to this one. So then we found ourselves with this not large space, considering most art spaces, but it's 5,500 square feet, 5,750, sorry. And we install every 2 years a new exhibition. It's a curated exhibition with a theme. And we have an opening party, this time with food trucks. So it was very casual. It's grown from 50 people to 250 people coming to the opening. But we're able to show pieces like the Vito Acconci wall bra, for instance. Now, it's impossible to think of that. We tried to install it in our home in San Francisco. That's not really possible. For any of you who've seen it or sat in it, you know it's this huge piece with metal structure that holds it up. And you sit in these two cups of the bra. And we had other pieces that were large. We now can do installations, which we had always wanted to do. We have one now by Amalia Ullman, and that was a great addition. We have something that Rikwit Tiravanija did for us in 2009, a wall mural about protests. As particularly, it started with ones in San Francisco, and then it went on to these news reports from all over the world. So it keeps growing. It's a very large piece, and we hope to leave it forever. He's given us permission to hang other art on that piece. So the answer to what we were looking for really was right there in our backyard, and we didn't realize it. It's right there for us to walk into it anytime we want, and we're thoroughly enjoying it. And I hope some of you will come sometime to visit. It is by appointment only, and we usually reserve it for museum groups, and we have to be there when you come. So it's a little restricted time-wise, but we hope that some of you will have a chance to come and see it sometime, and it's called Stonescape.
How do you envision its future? Will it always be a gallery, museum?
Yes, we are going to keep it that way as long as we're there, as long as we're alive. But upon our deaths, that's a question that has to be determined, because you can't separate it. You can't separate it from the property. There's no way to move it. The art in our collection has always been intended to go to museums, particularly to SF MoMA, and a couple of other smaller donations. But the primary portion of our collection is going to SF MoMA. So we can't really, we haven't thought of a way to make it work as a property to give to a museum. And I don't know of anyone in the family who'd like to run that as a project. And it's costly. It takes time and it takes money. So it's not only the art cave, that's not the expensive part, it's the rest of the property as well. You know, the vineyard, and in any event, we enjoy it very much, and we're so happy we came up with that solution. And it's the right size. It's not not particularly overly grand, but it's enough for us to show these large pieces, as I say, and some sort of normal-sized pieces that fit into whatever the theme is.
And is the pleasure in being able to show the work or share it with people? Is that?
Yes, that's the pleasure we have, and so that's why we try to limit it to museum groups, because otherwise we have people there who aren't really interested in art and don't particularly enjoy what we've done. So we visit it when we're up there, and that's why we did it, so that we could enjoy pieces that we were never going to be able to install otherwise. We had a 46-foot painting, a 46-foot long painting, which we eventually donated to SF MoMA because we weren't going to be able to install it. We could install it now, but In any event, it's also a fairly flexible space. We have a couple of walls that can be moved. In fact, we made a hole in one of them to show the late Pereno marquee and the Josephine Pride train that she did recently for it was part of the Turner Prize exhibition. So we have this little train and we have this marquee as part of it because we were able to make a different kind of space for it.
Okay. And Howard, it would be great if you tell us about your arrangement with the Dallas Museum of Art.
I'd be happy to, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this conversation. I guess I'm a bit of an old school, and I think my wife Cindy is as well. We're sort of old school, old museum models, and we very much believe in public museums and collections ultimately being either bequeathed or donated during our lifetime to museums. And obviously the Dallas Museum of Art, where both Cindy and I have spent our entire lives, is very dear to us. It's a classical, encyclopedic museum that is open to the public and has significant attendance. And we have always been supportive of the museum, even prior to the announcement of the special bequest. And I think to this day we remain very much about public spaces. About a little over a decade ago, at the brilliant suggestion of our dear friends Robert and Marguerite Hoffman, as part of a capital campaign at the museum, at Dallas Museum at that time, over a wonderful New Year's Eve visit to the Napa Valley, of all places. That place germinates really good ideas, I think. At any rate, they made the suggestion that as part of the impetus to get the campaign moving forward, they were prepared to pledge their collection to the museum and invited us to join them. And over some wonderful wine, and good friendship, we agreed. Upon returning home, a dear friend of ours, who I think at the time was chair of the Dallas Museum, Dee Dee Rose, said she wanted in on the fun. So the next thing we knew, we had all made this big promised gift that drew a lot of attention from, other institutions around the world. As well as in our own community, and the bequest, which is what it is essentially a bequest of our collection to the museum, whatever it looks like at that point in time. And interestingly enough, whatever that is, 13 years ago, the collections were still, not in their infancy, but they certainly weren't as extensive as they've evolved over the past decade. So part of the joy of this is we get to play amateur curator. And so we get to decide, at least initially, what pile or group of works are going to be given to the museum, and at least during our lifetimes, that's our opportunity. At our death, our bequest specifically has really no strings attached. The museum has the option of de-accessing, rearranging, adding to, whatever they want to do, whoever the leadership is at that point in time. We're making that leap of faith that people of goodwill and public-minded folks will continue to support the institution. And that's really it in a nutshell.
And you're also giving them your house as well. That's correct?
Along the way, we pledged the house in which we live, which was designed by Richard Meyer, which is just celebrating, if you will, its 20th anniversary. And that was sort of part of the deal, if you will.
And they can sell that if they want. I mean, they can do anything they want
Yeah,
to.
we took the position that if you start putting strings on it and you start trying to envision every possible machination and try to dream up every possible loophole or exception, that invariably you trap yourself or quite frankly, worse yet, you trap people who are of good public mind down the road as to how and what they should do. And so by leaving it the way we've done it, I think, again, the challenge is up to whatever the administration is that's running the institution at that point in time.
Mm-hmm. And how does the warehouse fit into that? I know that you're not giving, the warehouse isn't part of that bequest, but you built the warehouse. Was that to have a place to show your work? Was that for fun? How does that fit into your
If you're a
art
collector and you get beyond the point of being, somewhat serious about it, what turns out as a hobby eventually turns into an obsession and a preoccupation that you can't live without. And so, as is the case of Norah and other collectors who've built collections over long periods of time, you have more art than you can possibly exhibit at any one point in time. So invariably, art is in storage facilities. And for the better part of a decade and a half, I was paying a fortune in rent to have work sitting in crates in a space owned by someone else. So a good friend of mine, a trustee of the Dallas Museum, the late Vernon Faulkner, agreed to join with me and find a warehouse space or find a space where we could both store our collections as well as have some modest exhibition space. And we spent the better part of a year, like Norah, looking around for the right kind of place. By dint of circumstance, we ultimately found a building that was 50,000 square feet, which was larger than we really needed. But some young guys were starting an art handling firm, and so Vernon and I bought the building. We sublet about 40%, a little less than 40% of the space to an art handling firm. So it was not necessary for us to hire art handlers full time. We literally knocked on the door next door and say, we want to take this down and put this up. Well, the project got a little out of hand, not so much economically, but in terms of what it turned out to be. And so essentially we have 17,000 feet of exhibition space, and we have 8,000 feet of deep storage. We have an education program and a program director, and we really run the warehouse like a private museum, if you will. We do open it to almost anyone that basically calls up and wants to come, but because we don't have guards on the collection and we have to create some degree of control to protect the art, we do ask people to make an appointment. But our goal as it's evolved, and quite frankly, it's been an evolutionary thing, is to add to the cultural landscape in the community, to provide another resource, another place where one can view contemporary art, one can discuss contemporary art. And because we have these grand spaces, it makes for very interesting opportunities to explore interesting ideas. And so that's really the way the warehouse has evolved to this point. Where it'll be 10 years from now, I can't really address it. Cindy and I have bought out Vernon's interest in the warehouse, so it's now totally under our control, and it's sort of to be continued. We're open to suggestions.
Okay. So I'm interested to know how all of you, and I suppose from Neal, I would ask about the Fishers, what the relationship is with curators, advisors. Do you collect with a museum collection in mind? Did the Fishers do that? I mean, I know the Fishers sometimes purchased in collaboration with other trustees of the museum. Who should we start with? Why don't we talk about the Fishers and because their collection was actually very in sync with the museum's collection.
I think it's important. It's important to say that just listening to Norah and to Howard speak. I mean, I think, have the great good fortune to live in two cities that are extremely philanthropic. I mean, just as you've heard from both of them, and obviously what's happened with our museum, these are great communities of people that care about the public culture. And you know, rather than speak specifically about the Fishers, one of the things I would like to actually say is that going back to the 1990s, when our museum opened in 1995 on 3rd Street, there was a campaign to build our collection. We didn't have such a great collection at that time. And in those days, a private individual, Norman and Norah are great examples of this, you could buy a work of art and make a fractional gift of that work to the museum. And then over time, you would complete that gift over the course of many, many years. And many, many members of our community did this. And sometimes our collectors collected together and made fractional gifts, only because the tax law changed did that become less opportune for a collector to collect that way. But there was a time when we had, I think, 300 or 400 fractional gifts to the museum from generous individuals who bought things with the museum in mind. That clearly with the intention that over time might initially make 10% fractional gift, but over time the remaining interest in that work would come to the museum. Really great public-spirited and a wonderful way to collect, with the museum in mind. I think many times this developed out of conversations between artists, collectors, and curators and directors. So a real kind of team approach was really in place for a long time. And unfortunately, the tax law changed about, I don't know, a decade or so ago and made that less advantageous. But I think many people in our community, the Fishers among them, have participated in that kind of collecting activity.
But to go back to that original question, well, Howard, for instance, I believe that you and the other collectors involved in that deal, for lack of a better word.
Partnership.
Yeah, partnership. You're all collecting you've all taken different areas of specialization.
Again, it's almost a matter of serendipity. By dint of circumstance, you had 3 couples, all of whom were close personal friends and social friends, as well as professional friends in the sense of public-mindedness for the museum. And we each had collections that evolved in their own unique and idiosyncratic way, if you will. So there was and continues to be a certain sense of, particularly as it becomes known that it is going to be part of a public collection, you do think about, all right, the museum does not have an X, and we're really interested in this little niche of the art world or art history that for which that X would be a really perfect example. That would be an additional impetus for making a commitment to do it. And over the years, we've had great relationships with our contemporary curators, and actually with the director. Jack Lane was our director, who was formerly director at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Was very keen on making it really well known of what would be wonderful for the museum to have, and would you be so kind as to consider these works. So I think while each collection has its own identity, there is clearly this notion that it's ultimately for the public domain and that will inure to the benefit of the museum.
And you work with an advisor, don't you?
I do. I have worked with a gentleman named Alan Schwartzman, who's evolved into a company called Art Agency Partners with Amy Capolazzo and Adam Chin, and they sold their business to Sotheby's at the end of last year. So he's now part of that organization, but he continues to advise our collection. And I was, in fact, his first client. He had been a writer and a critic, and
oh, that's interesting.
And so we just left Alan an hour and a half ago, just catching up a little bit. Now he's so busy, you have to make an appointment to see him now that he's a big shot at Sotheby's. But he helped in the formation of our collection, and quite frankly, also helped in the formation of the Rose collection.
So, but when it comes to relating to the museum and working with the museum, is it you who's involved with the museum, or would it be Alan who's relating to the museum? Do you see what I mean?
It would be us, but he clearly is keenly aware of what the museum has, what it needs. He's also very close with our curators that have been at the museum over the last 15 or 20 years, it's just been a natural and logical progression. If you sit down and visit with curators, and that's what the great joy of being a collector is to sort of usurp a little bit of these great minds that are out there that can give you fresh perspective, and that's sort of part of the growing process of collecting, which is the reason that it stays so dynamic, and it's the reason we're here at Miami Basel looking for goodies.
And Norah, what about you? I believe you work with an advisor?
We do. For many years, more than 25 years, we worked with Thea Westreich. And she now is retired, so we work with her former partner, Suzanne Modica. But we met Thea through the curator at John Caldwell, who came with Jack Lane before he came to Dallas. Yes, from Pittsburgh. They came from the Carnegie in, I think, 1987. So it was John Caldwell who really introduced us to contemporary art. We were, at that point, collecting European modern art, which we quickly deaccessioned once we decided to go in a different direction. So we have been, we worked with John. He was our guide through the early years, and he and Thea talked several times a week, so they were very close, knew what the museum wanted to collect, had an idea of what we were interested in, because our interests did not necessarily coincide with the other collectors in San Francisco, and that's a very good thing, because, for instance, we weren't collecting the same things as the Fishers were collecting, or some of the other major collectors in the city. So we had that great fortune of not duplicating in most cases. So the pieces that were just on show that were from our collection, I believe there were 28 of them that were shown for the opening, and those were
Which
all...
you had just donated to SF MoMA, is that
We just
correct?
donated, and they were in honor of John Caldwell. He was the greatest influence. Thea has been amazing. We couldn't have had anyone better to lead us through the process, but because she was of a like mind with John, there was a great deal of consistency there. We continue to collect young artists.
Okay.
And we're hoping that very shortly SF MoMA will have a new contemporary curator. Thank you, Neal. Just pushing a little bit here.
Oh, so that hasn't, okay.
That hasn't been announced.
Hold that thought.
I'm holding
I was
it.
expecting there'd be an announcement at the fair, but I guess, I thought maybe I'd missed it, but I guess not. Okay. And the Fishers collected on their own without an advisor, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. I think Don Doris started collecting in the mid-late 70s. I don't know that, and maybe you two could help me with this. I'm not sure art consultants were quite as common, not that they're so common today, but there are obviously many more art consultants today than there were then. It was, I would say probably it was a little, maybe a little bit easier to be a collector then. It's never been easy, but I think you didn't have the proliferation of art fairs and all the activity that surrounds contemporary art today. So it was possible for them to really work with dealers. They knew their own mind, and as Doris says to me sometimes, why would we want to give up the fun of meeting the artists and being in their studios? And so it's something they cared really deeply about.
So one of the things that, Neal, that you and I talked about when we were talking about that first Fisher collection show was the effect of having the depth of that collection of having so much work by single artists on view, and how valuable that was, and how valuable it was to the curators to have that to work with. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I'd love to.
Okay.
One of the things that we've done in San Francisco, if you've not been, I hope you'll have a chance to come visit us. We we have an opportunity just to do something very special because of the way, not just the Fisher family, but the Stones and many, many other families. It's a real community of collectors in San Francisco. Have collected is that we now have great depth in our holdings of certain key artists of the late 20th century. So, we have 4 rooms of Ellsworth Kelly, or 3 rooms of Gerhard Richter, or
And that
on and on and on.
And that doesn't all come from just the Fisher collection.
Not all. I mean, considerable extent, yes, but not by no means all. And so it allows us to tell stories about certain artists that perhaps other museums can't quite do. I mean, I was struck. I just came yesterday from London and was opening the Robert Rauschenberg retrospective on Tuesday night, and I was struck walking through the Tate galleries how differently they present their collections, where they've really expanded, I would say, brilliantly internationally, and there's great range to their holdings internationally. But it tends to be a particular work by a particular artist. And and you have this marvelous survey of contemporary art internationally, but you come to San Francisco and you're going to see great holdings of certain artists. That's I think, rather singular at this time.
Well, just anecdotally, and this is, a compliment, but not a forced compliment. I had the pleasure of going through the museum and seeing the Fisher collection and the new installation, and I went through with the president of another institution, which has a great collection, and the president of that museum walked out of the exhibition with us and just shook his head. He couldn't believe how extraordinary it was, that this was unlike anything he had ever seen. So you're on the right path.
Thank you, Howard.
So the other thing I'd like to talk about, because actually we don't have that much more time, so I'm going to try to limit it, I suppose, to 2 more topics. Howard, you had mentioned that you don't like the idea of placing restrictions on your gifts. Before, when we talked about it, when we talked on the phone, you were curious about the gifts, about the limitations that had been placed on the Fisher collection, about how often the works need to be shown and how they need to be shown. And you mentioned maybe having some questions for Neal about that.
Yeah, I was just curious, the first installation is great, this next 3 will be brilliant, but I wonder how, if there is a mandate to exhibit a significant part of the works all the time, does that ultimately, at some point in time, force you to go into another building campaign because you need even more real estate? We know collections are not getting any smaller. They're only going to grow, hopefully, both in terms of quantity, but in terms of quality and intellectual gravitas. But I am certain, but I don't have any idea what the nuances of the relationship is. And in 4 years, what do you have to do to maneuver things around?
So it's a long, complicated agreement, but in essence, the story is this: that we would not have accepted the collection if we had to have it on view in a static way all the time. I mean, as important as collections are, you need to keep the museum dynamic and changing. You don't want somebody to come and think they've seen your museum just once. Right. So in essence, what happens is, and this is essentially the story of how we opened, every 10 years or every decade, there is what we might call in the art world a monographic show of Fisher collection works. And we opened with this presentation now. And then in years 2 through 9, or the remaining years of this particular decade, we integrate collections. So, there are great Kellys and Richters and Polkas and Kiefers and Agnes Martins and so on and so forth. But we have great works by those artists too. And so we're going to have the opportunity, when the real fun begins for our curators, is when they be able to really integrate our collections with their collections, bring Norah and Norman's works onto view in the same floors and really mix it up and make it more dynamic. And then year 10, we'll come back and we'll celebrate the Fishers again. And then this will continue on a kind of, once a decade rhythm through the course of 100 years.
Mm-hmm. That's
the essential situation.
So then the other thing I wanted to discuss was how relationships between museums and collectors have changed, because 10 years ago we were really at this moment where it seemed as though collectors were peeling away and threatening to take their collections off and build their own private museums and not donate them to public institutions. And now that seems to, well, I wrote a story about it for the Times just about exactly 10 years ago, and Mitch Rales had just opened Glenstone, the Eli Broad Museum. The first Eli Broad Museum was about to open at LACMA with all sorts of strings attached, as I recall. Let's see, Crystal Bridges was about to open. You know, a whole lot of other things were happening that made everybody so nervous. And now it all seems to have died down, and nobody seems, I don't know whether we've gotten used to it or if the situation has changed, but what do you think?
I think there are fewer people doing it for many reasons. Perhaps part of it's a tax reason. We did not take advantage of that tax, I won't call it a loophole, that arrangement that one can have, but many people did, and maybe they're realizing now that there is surveillance on that, there is oversight from the government on that, so they are restricted. They have to be open a certain number of days a month, I believe. Also, I think it's work to have a private museum. You know, you have to take care of it. In our case, it's all going to a museum in any event, so it's not as though it's going to stay there permanently, but some of them, I think, have in mind to have it in perpetuity in their own private space and have others run it.
It takes a lot of work to
It's
keep
work.
one of those things
It's work to
going.
do it, yes.
And you have to have another generation that
Exactly.
wants to do it
Exactly.
for you and have the will to keep on with it.
Yes,
And the resources. It's hugely expensive to
Very.
run these institutions. So it's a little like they say, you build a building. That's the least expense you have. It's the operating expenses that every public institution gets behind on in the ensuing decades, and that's where where you're pushing that rock up a hill. The goal really is to, if you can, is to have as much, obviously, cliche, is to have as much endowment to support those kinds of operational expenses, so that the new money, if you will, that comes into the institution is spent on scholarships, spent on acquisitions, is spent on building out curatorial teams, about exploring fresh ways of looking at contemporary art. The very definition of contemporary art is that I think that it's actually changing all the time. And you know, I go around the fair now, I feel like a relic, because there's so many new materials, works done by young artists that, quite frankly, are baffling to me. But I love the idea of the challenge of trying to learn a little bit about it. But I think that's really the threshold. If you have a private space, you do have to continue to operate it. And even if you have the unlimited resources that say Crystal Bridges does, or the Broad does, or Kino does, or Glenstone does, it's still a huge burden, and it takes a lot of time, energy, and commitment to to do that.
You know, I think another point that could be made is, you know, with the Rosovskys and the Stones and many, many other people who have open, I'll call them semi-public spaces for their collections. A lot of it also is about their passion. You know, it's their passion. When visitors come to see Stonescape or come to see the Rachofsky's collection, it's about their passion in talking about what they've done and how they acquired works and their relationships with the artists that makes these I'll call them institutions, I use the term advisedly, really come alive and breathe and be dynamic. And that's what I think is so special about this moment is, you know, the museums are here and the collections will come to us in due course, but to have this kind of dynamic presence in the contemporary field is really pretty special. And I think it's to be celebrated. So, you know, I think it's a good thing.
And you've mentioned museums needing to be more creative about how you attract those collections to you. Is there a way? Have you figured out the magic?
Well, you know, I think we've created a model that I think others. I mean, I know when I go to museum director conferences and I speak about what I've done or we've done. I should not say I hate to say what we've done as a community. people are very interested, and I think they're watching to see how it works. But we're testing something new. You know, if you live in San Francisco, the word that the watchword of our lives in San Francisco is innovation. And it's all about innovation. And let's think outside the box. Let's try something new. If it doesn't work, we'll try something else. And so we'll see how it all goes.
I think we need to go to the audience for questions now. I just saw someone making signs. So does somebody go around with a microphone? Oh, we have 2 more minutes? Oh, we have 2 microphones. Okay, questions?
Then you guys can keep talking.
Okay.
We've answered all the questions.
Fine, that's easy. But if somebody has a question, wave your arms really strongly.
I would just like to add
Yeah.
something to what Neal just said.
Okay.
When someone comes to see our collection, we insist on being there because for that very reason. You and I know from visiting many collections throughout the world with museum groups, it makes a difference if the person is there to tell you the story of why they did this, what they did, what their purpose was, what they're going to do with their art later. And so I think that is one of the big commitments you make. It's not just a financial commitment. It's not just a commitment of your time. It's a commitment to tell other people about art and about why you're passionate about it, or why you became passionate about it along the way. So I think that is an important part of the commitment.
So how do we support that?
Oh, we need a microphone over here, I think, because we
How
do
do you
have a
support
question.
that?
So if we were to come to a semi-private entity,
Right.
would there be a place for us to say, thank you for showing us this? We'd like to invest in what you've done. So if we come to a semi-private
Right.
entity with our museum group, per se,
Right.
would we then be able to say thank you for this innovative third way of engaging in public art? How do we say thank you, Norah, in a profound way, be it small or large? Would you then say make the gifts to SF MoMA or?
Yes, we would steer them in that
Okay.
direction. We can't accept
Of
gifts,
course, of
obviously.
course.
But I would say, for instance, at the fair yesterday,
Right.
I saw many people here from the ICA. They had been to visit us very recently, and it was so lovely to have them say, you know, I want to tell you about this Vern Blossom painting that's over in such and such gallery. I mean, who ever heard of Vern Blossom before? But we have a painting of his, whoever he may be, Vern Blossom being a sort of unknown person, did art in the 60s, but there's work here being shown, recent work. So apparently he's going to appear very shortly and reveal his identity. However, it's that kind of thing that makes a difference. These people came to see us. They remembered the visit. They made lovely comments to us here as well as at the time.
And is that the other reason for your engagement in semi-public is to just reveal new and interesting artists?
Well, I think it's to stimulate thoughts about art. Why do we have art? What does it reflect? Why are artists asking these questions? Shouldn't we be asking ourselves? Issues with the speech just before this was about gender. And there are lots of gender identity issues that one can explore that way. Politics. And the piece we have by Rick addresses the idea of protests. And some of these protests were about gay marriage, some are about Black Lives Matter. And so we keep updating it because there are new ideas appearing everywhere in the world, and we all need to think about what they mean. And of course, in America, we're faced with some new challenges. So.
Well, if you're also wondering what you can do, go back to your community and encourage others to be generous to their local institutions. I think they're all over the world, and at least we've found that the more people that come to visit us, they go home with hopefully some inspiration and some fresh ideas. In the same way that when we have the privilege of going to visit collections around the world, we always walk away with something, either a new idea or a fresh approach, or something that stimulates the continuation of the conversation.
I I think there are also collectors. I mean, there's one collector couple who I think of who've contributed to the art world without contributing to a museum. It's Andy and Deborah Rappaport, who've opened Minnesota Street Project, which is low-cost spaces for artists and dealers who've been priced out of the real estate market in San Francisco. And that's a fascinating way to use their resources for the betterment of art, but without contributing to a museum. Sorry, Neal.
No, but that's become an important part of the ecosystem of the Bay Area.
Yeah, and I think that's just a fascinating way to have done it.
And theirs is a kind of hybrid because it was started. They didn't want to form a nonprofit, but they didn't want to have a for-profit, so they've somehow worked it out.
Right.
And he's a former jazz musician, so it's all
Oh, I
or
didn't know
rock
that.
and roll. Sorry, he's got a whole collection of guitars. But they did this for artists as well. They have studios there,
Yeah.
so it's a new concept, and I think more and more of that is happening. And we have the world of technology around us in San Francisco, so those innovations are really popping up everywhere.
I'm sorry, we have one passionate last question right here.
I just wanted to say, though, that the Rappaports, in addition to doing the Minnesota Street Project, they also do find ways to buy art and contribute it to museums. We happen to be a recipient of one of the pieces that they've done that at the Nevada Museum of Art in Reno. So I think I just wanted to kind of state that because I think what they're doing is innovative, but I also think that they have found ways to continue to contribute to museums as well as to innovate with the things they're doing for galleries and artists.
Fair enough. Any questions?
I think, one of the things we've
yes.
heard this afternoon is that sometimes it's presented as though the private collectors who form their own, semi-public, semi-private spaces for their collections are somehow at odds with museums. And I think if we've heard one thing today, above all else, is that's not really the case. That these are individuals who work very closely with their respective museums, very, very closely, very supportive. It's both and, not either or. And it does create this wonderful kind of art world that we work in.
Well, I do wonder if maybe the situation 10 years ago was more combative or more, challenging. And now maybe it's become more accepted, so it feels less challenging. But I realized about a quarter of the way through this panel, I was completely confused about what the third way was and how it differed from the first and second. So
It's about partnership.
Right.
It's really about partnership.
So
It's a way to make 1 and 1 equal 3, and that's always a good idea.
right. Or 2 and 2 equal 3. Anyway, well, if there are no more questions, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.